Flora of the Garden of the Gods, part of the Rocky Mountain Field Institute Citizen Science Training. After watching this video, volunteers will be able to discuss the ecological differences between native and non-native plant species in an ecosystem and identify native and non-native plant species in our project areas. Understanding plant identities. What do native, non-native, exotic, alien, and invasive mean when describing plants? Native plants are historically present species. In the context of the garden, all native species are desirable because the land management objectives are to protect the resource and to provide a recreational opportunity. In contrast, for example, in an agricultural context, not all native species are desirable. For example, milkweed is poisonous to cattle, but it is essential for monarch butterfly survival because they're obligate to the milkweed and monarch undergo a very long migration. So increases in agricultural landscapes have made it difficult for monarchs to make this migration. Non-native and exotic and alien mean the same thing. These are all plants that are introduced to the landscape. A little subset of non-native, exotic, or alien species are invasive species. These are introduced species with a competitive advantage. They outcompete the native species and are actively pushing the native vegetation out of its niche. Not all non-native species are invasive. And so when we think about our resource and restoration objectives, we typically are concerned about the invasive species first because they will take a hold on the landscape and be very difficult to eradicate. So why do we care if plants are native? Maybe we should just care if there are plants there. So native plants have evolved with other native species in the ecosystem. So if you've already watched the ecology video, you have started to think a bit about how organisms are interacting with each other in the landscape. So if organisms have evolved together, then they have a collective survival strategy, okay? So, for example, we might see signs that talk about protecting the wildlife habitat. And we might hear people say that native plants increase wildlife values. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. If we have animals and they rely on plant species and invertebrates to survive, then in that way the native plants and wildlife are serving each other in critical ecological ways. They're relying on each other for habitat, for food, and for ecosystem services. So pollination is a really simple one. A lot of plant species require a pollinator, an invertebrate, to complete their sexual reproduction process. But we can also think about how temperature and light and moisture are controlled by the vegetation. So if you watch the aspect video, you can see that like in the north aspects, there's more forest development, it's shadier on the ground. So then the species that have evolved and adapted to living there are used to it being shady. If those trees went away, then those plants would no longer be in the appropriate habitat. They'd probably dry out and die. So when we're talking about wildlife, we want to expand our view. We want to just not think about the warm and fuzzies and the pretty birds. We want to think about how wildlife includes all of the invertebrates that perform essential functions in our landscape, like nutrient cycling underground, those pollination services we just talked about, or by being a food source for rodents, birds, etc., who are then eaten by organisms in higher trophic levels. So when a trail or area is restored in the garden, we spread a native seed mix. These are some of the species that are in our native seed mix. We've talked about some of these already, but take a look, most of them are grasses, okay? And grasses really support the small mammal population, and then getting into the ungulates and larger herbivores in our landscape that feed the top predators, the raptors and dog species like coyotes, etc. in the garden. There are also many native forbs. We don't typically spread these in great abundance during restoration because the seeds are very expensive, but they are present and important on the landscape. So one of the most stately of our native species is this prince's plume on the left. And then more commonly, you will see these species of sage. There are many Artemisia species in the garden. Um, this purple ground cherry in the middle is part of the solanaceous family, so related to tomatoes and potatoes, for example. The liatris in the top right corner, the gay feather, very important species for our invertebrates, produce a lot of nectar later in the season. Some other native species here, we have prickly pear cactus, which we see in the scrublands primarily. They are very drought tolerant species. Then we also have many penstemon species. These are important for soil stability. They are mat forming perennials, so they spread out from their root systems. Then we have tons of asters. One of the most attractive is the prairie coneflower here. More Artemisia here, the sagebrush, and then of course Indian paintbrush, an iconic species here in Colorado. In the garden we also have many exotic species. So these might be plants that we intentionally introduced a long time ago to create forage for horses and cattle, but a lot of exotic species were brought here by accident. When we colonized the New World, we brought these species to our gardens because they reminded us of home. But here in this landscape, they have some kind of competitive advantage and therefore are taking over the landscape. So in this picture here, Canada thistle, huge problem in mesic areas along creeks. They spread by rhizomes, which are underground roots, and virtually impossible to eradicate. And then, of course, the flowers um, release thousands and millions of seeds, which germinate readily on the landscape. Some other species of concern, the diffuse knapweed is allelopathic. So what that means is when the knapweed takes a hold in the landscape, it actually sends out chemicals in the soil that make it harder for other plants to grow. And so this would be a great example of invasive plants, not just non-native ones. The Dalmatian toadflax, same thing in the more mesic areas, spread by vegetative means, by roots, and can really take over very quickly. Same thing with the leafy spurge. And sorry, I had the wrong name here. This is the musk thistle. Looking over here, this is the Canada thistle. Notice how the musk thistle opens to a flat inflorescence, and it's pretty large. This is as large as, a silver dollar. But looking back at the Canada thistle, these flowers are much smaller. They have a teardrop sepal complex, and then it's kind of like a Fraggle. Anyone who watched Fraggle Rock, it's a little burst of hair-like petals at the top of that teardrop shape. Some more exotic plants. We have Poison hemlock is a very large species, taller than a human being. Clematis, which are able to grow on top of other vegetation. There are native clematis species, but this is not one of them. And they make these, again, very Fraggle-esque fuzzy top flowers. And then the hoary cress is another more dryland species. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are over 250 plants that have been identified in the garden. And you can get started understanding these lesser visible species in the garden by following these references.